Hi, today we're going to do something slightly different. When I gave this class last week about Lot's wife, I forgot to record. So first of all, for the sake of the protocol, and number two, for those who are unable to join us every week, Tuesdays at 11, I'm going to record this class and we're going to add it to our archive. And just gonna share my screen here. Okay, so Our Lady today is the wife of Lot, Lot's wife, and her name was Idit or Irit. I know that in the past I have talked about her. I mentioned her a few years ago, but just kind of very briefly when it was in the context of discussing the story of her daughters. The famous story where the daughters of Lot ended up after the destruction of Sodom with him in the cave, and consequently they give birth to Ammon and Moab. But what I'd like to do is to go back to the story of the destruction of Sodom, I'm sorry, and not only that, to see if we can take this idea and to the next level of the idea, the message of Sodom. And I want to dedicate this shiur to the memory of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, alav shalom, zecher tzadik livracha. A giant who left us way too early. I very often quote his Torah, his teaching, but today what I would like to do is something slightly different. When Rabbi Sacks was here as our guest at Hillel at Bet Jacob a couple of years ago, I had the zchut, I had the merit to have a semi-private almost meeting with him as part of faculty of Hillel. A couple of us got together with him, and I had a chance to share with him an idea that I was starting to develop at that time. And the idea was talking about the first matzah and the connection, perhaps a connection between Sodom and Egypt. And if you remember, some of you remember, I gave that shiur talking about this first matzah that appears for the first time in the story of Sodom. And I shared with him my findings, and he said to me two words on that. He said, "Keep digging, you will find more." And he inspired me to search for more information, and what I'm happy to share with you today. I think it's a very, very important, very powerful lesson, and that was inspired I was inspired by Rabbi Sacks, and so I think that perhaps the most meaningful tribute is to continue learning, and I would like to dedicate this shiur today, Leilui Nishmato. Okay, the story of Lot's wife is actually only 5 words in the Tanakh. As we remember, very, very famous story, the angels come to Sodom. They need to turn over to destroy that city because people are very, very bad. And they come to the city and nobody wants to host them. Nobody wants to give them a place to lodge and food, except for Lot. Lot lives there already for a while. Lot is the nephew of Abraham, and he lives there and he takes them home. The people of Sodom learn that Lot had guests, and they request to take those guests and to treat them according to the laws of Sdom. We have to understand that Midat Sdom, the characteristic of Sdom was what is mine, what's yours is yours, and they didn't do chesed. They didn't do anything that beyond what is just and right. I don't have to do anything to you, but you're not going to do anything to me. That was what the society was based on. And of course, Lot refuses, and later on, the angels tell him that they're going to destroy the city, and they tell him to pack up his family, take his family, nothing else, and flee the city. Of course, as we know, because we read the story before that, has to do with Abraham pleading on behalf of Sodom, and because of the zchuyot of Abraham, Kadosh Baruch Hu probably, or perhaps decided to spare the life of Lot as well. So Lot and his daughters and his wife are running away from the city as the city is being destroyed. And here the pasuk says the following: "Vatabet ishto me'acharav," but his wife looked back from behind him. "Vatehi netziv melach," and she became a pillar of salt. Now, before getting into the interpretations of that, I want to go back for a second to the first slide here. This is a pillar of salt that you can see very clearly today if you drive on Route 90. When Yam HaMelach, the Dead Sea, is on your left, and you're going to look all the way up. This particular rock is called Lot's wife. And according to tradition, it's believed that this is the one. It's also very salty, and a lot of salt mineral in that rock. Whether it's right or not, almost irrelevant. We're going to discuss that a little bit later. But at least this is the tradition, that this unusual rock is called Eshet Lot. Okay, the Ramban says on that, Ufirgei de Rabbi Eliezer, the Ramban quotes the Midrash, says that Irit ishto shelo, that her name was Irit. Later on, we're going to see another version that's called her Idit. Now, if you notice, the letters Reish and Daled in Hebrew, they look very similar. And what it means that perhaps both sources quote the same tradition. It's just because of the quality of the printing, or actually it's way before printing, the quality and the legibility of the text. The Reish and the Dalet sometimes got mixed up. So we're going to see another source that says that her name was Idit and not Irit. Okay, either way. The Abarbanel says the following. ולי נראה על דרך הפשט, and according to the pshat, the simple understanding of the text, because what is it that everybody's trying to everybody's grappling with? They're going to grapple of what is the reason that Lot's wife turned back. All right, the angels told them, do not look back. Right? They told him, Himalet al nafshecha al tabet acharecha. Run away for your life, do not look back. Physically, metaphorically, it doesn't matter, but they said it to them. And she did. And the question is that all the commentators are dealing with, what is the reason? Why did she look back? So Abarbanel says, when the angels warned Lot not to look back, what is the reason that they had to warn him not to look back? Because he had a lot of property. And they told him, nonetheless, even though you have all this wealth and all that property, you're not going to take anything with you. Therefore, they told him in a guiding way, and they gave him advice. Himalet al nafshecha, run for your life. Ki תהיה לך לשלל, because your life is going to be your reward. ואל תבט אחריך לנחשים ולרכוש. Don't look back to the properties, to the money, to all the stuff you're leaving behind. כי כולו נאבד בלי תקווה. No hope for all of that. ואל תעמוד בכל הכיכר בחושבך שמפה ומפה תציל דבר מכל אשר לך. And don't delay, don't stop when you're running away thinking that here and here you're going to take a little bit of cash, you're going to take a little bit of jewelry, you're going to take a little bit of anything, and you'll be able to salvage some of the stuff that you have. כי אין עוד תקווה בדבר הזה. There's no hope for that. Just give up on everything that you have and be happy that you have your life. So based on that, we can understand that what is the reason for Lot's wife to look back? It's because she was hoping to gather, or at least it was difficult for her to leave behind all the money, all the property. The Bechor Shol has a different interpretation. He says the following, רוץ מהרה ואל תבט אחריך. What does it mean? כי הענן עולה ובו גופרית ואש ומתפשט על הארץ. Because the cloud of fire is going up. ואם ידביק אתכם הרי אתם מתים. And if that cloud is going to catch up with you, you're going to die. ותבט אשתו הייתה מבטת מתאחרת שלא הייתה ממהרת ללך. And what happened with Lot's wife? She was taking her time, and she was looking back, and she's waiting, right? It's just like, have you ever tried to move a crowd from one place to the other? Like, for example, in the wedding, you have like the badekin, and then people are going to the chuppah, right? You know, how long does it take to move people? The people take their time, they schmooze, whatever. שלא הייתה ממהרת ללך, and she took her time. עד שנשארה מאחריו והתבקתה הענן הנפשט ונפרס עליה מן הגופרית ומן המלח. And what happened was that physically, it's not that there was any particular reason according to the Bechor Shol, to this interpretation, she was just caught up, the cloud, the storm caught up with her, and she became that pillar of salt. ונראה שיש שם תל מלח, לפי פשוטו של הפסוק, ועדיין נרד בארץ ההיא. And he said, also supports this tradition, that indeed there is a pillar of salt that time in that place, and it still exists. Josephus Flavius in קדמוניות היהודים, Josephus Flavius says something a little bit different. ואשתו של לוט הייתה פונה תכופות בשעת הבריחה לצד העיר. While they were running away from Sodom, the wife of Lot was looking back, while running, looking back at the city. Te'eva ladat. She was really consumed with a will to know. She really wanted to know something. מה מתרחש מסביב לה? What's going on? על אף האיסור שאסר אלוהים לעשות זאת, even though God said not to do that. ולפיכך נהפכה לנציב מלח, and therefore she became a pillar of salt. אני ראיתי את זה והוא קיים עוד עד כיום. I saw that pillar of salt, and it exists even today. It's something like, think about it when there's, God forbid, a car accident or something like that in the other lane. But in your lane, there's no accident, but nonetheless, everybody stops to look. It's kind of almost human nature. This is why. So it's something similar. He suggests that even though she was told not to, she had that need to know what's going on. What's happening there? She couldn't resist, even though God told her no. And she became a pillar of salt. Bikeda Rabbi Eliezer, that's the other source, says, first of all, Edith. Her name was Edith, as we discussed, Daled instead of a Reish. אשת לוט נחמרו רחמיה על בנותיה הנשואות בסדום. He brings a total different tradition, saying what? נחמרו רחמיה על בנותיה הנשואות בסדום. She felt bad. She felt feelings of mercy on her daughters, married daughters, who stayed in Sodom. והביטה לראות אם היו הולכות אחריה עם לאו. And she remained to stay in Sodom. She wanted to see if they were staying in Sodom or whether they follow them. וראתה אחרי השכינה ונעשתה נצי מלח, and of course that caused them to stay to become a pillar of salt. Now, before expanding on that, I want to go and kind of back to here and kind of summarize those couple of opinions. So according to Abarbanel, it's because of property, because of money. Pretty negative outlook on the wife of Lot. The Bechor Shor, so it was just circumstances. He delayed, it was just timing. But according to Josephus Flavius, it was different, right? It's kind of, she couldn't resist. And I want to talk about it for just a second. Because Lot's wife, her looking back represents a human characteristic in a time of pain or destruction. And what happens? What is represented? It's that urge to give up. Okay, I want to stay a little bit longer with the past, even if it's going to be dangerous or not really possible. You know, have you noticed like how difficult it is sometimes to say goodbye? Now, sometimes like, you know, when you have guests or whatever, or you have family gathering, whatever, and it's like, you can spend like a whole year together. And then at the very moment, at the last moment, just like, you know, you got to run to the gate, you got to catch a flight. And it's like, it's the last second, like, you know, squeeze another minute. Because perhaps there's a temptation to stay in the past, to stay in that what was, because there's a fear of the future with the without. So the wife of Lot actually represents the entire conflict of human character between conscience and impulse, between going forward without any sentiments or nostalgic. Somebody, you know, who wants just a little bit longer and want just yet one more look towards the past. And we have to remember that sometimes there are times in life where looking back into the past is a good thing. You need to do that. But sometimes you have to understand that it might paralyze you. It might prevent you from going to the new place where there's hope. It's this inability to accept the new reality. It's a delusion, and a delusion leads to failure. And she becomes a pillar of salt because that represents this idea of freezing situation, to freeze things and to keep them, maintain them the way they are. And that's the fear. And this is, sometimes we have to remember that even though it's very, very painful, you have to move forward. If you're not going to move forward, you might end up as a pillar of salt. Now, I want to go to the other approach. And that approach says what? That she had children there, and she wanted to see if they are following her or not. Now, where does the Midrash comes with this idea that she had other children, two other daughters? Because we know about two daughters. The Torah doesn't tell us about two daughters that stayed in Sodom. And then Ibn Ezra says the following: Bet banot acharot hayu lo umetu b'Sodom. Very straightforward. Lot didn't have only the two daughters that we read about, but he had two other daughters, and those died in Sodom. The Abarbanel expand on that, and he said those married daughters, they died in Sodom with the rest of the city, ki yihiyu nesuot lezarim, because they were married to foreigners, i.e., locals. Okay, and he's saying something here that is probably not PC in the year 2020. והאישה תלך אחרי בעלה בדעותיה ובמידותיה. And a woman follows her husband with her ideas and her acts. And therefore, bnot Lot hanesuim metu b'Sodom, and therefore those married daughters of Lot died in Sodom, since their husbands decided to stay there, and they were bad people, representative of Sodom, and the daughters of Lot, even though they were the daughters of a righteous person, at least relatively to the city, since they got married to evil people from Sodom, they become like them, and they stayed in Sodom and died. The Ramban. וייתכן שהיו לו בנים גדולים נשואי נשים. It is possible that he had married children. ודיבר עם חתניו תחילה, and first he spoke to his son-in-laws, his sons-in-law. וכאשר צחקו עליו חתניו, וערכו הדברים ביניהם, and when they made fun of him, they didn't believe him that indeed the place is going to be destroyed. And things got longer and longer. It started to become morning. השחר עלה, והמלאכים לא הניחו לקחת רק הנמצאים איתו בבית, and the angels told him, too late. You're gonna take with you only those people with you. You don't have time to go to your daughter's houses and take them with you. God is not waiting. There's a schedule, and we're going to destroy the city. And that is connected to the previous story in the Chumash. Because in the Chumash, if you remember, just before that, what happens is that Abraham is arguing with God about the future of Sodom. And he starts to bargain. Oh, God, please save the city of Sodom for 50 people, 40, 30, 20. And then he stops at 10. And the question is, why 10? Because we know about Lot and his daughters, and his wife. That's 4. So where those 6 additional people are going to come from? Why did he stop at 10? And the Midrash asks that. Lama asara, why 10? And the answer, Shahaya savur sheyesh asara. Because Abraham believed that there were 10 righteous people in Sodom. How come? Lot ve'ishto, Lot and his wife, that's 2. V'daled benotav, 4 daughters, v'daled chatanav, and 4 daughters, sons-in-law. What are you talking about, 4 sons-in-law? We just learn about 2 daughters that flee the city with him. So if they were married as well, where are those sons-in-law? Right? It seems that he had, perhaps according to the Midrashim that we just learned, that 2 married daughters. Okay, that means 2 sons-in-law. But the other 2 were not married. So either way, it doesn't add up because we're talking about 10 people. So the answer is, Arba banot hayu lo, shtayim arusot u'shtayim nesuot. So Lot and his wife had a total of 4 daughters. 2 were married, and 2 were engaged. Okay. The following is also an interpretation that I found in a website called Hidabrut. What was going on over there? Why did Lot's wife turn into a pillar of salt? So that God הוא נתן לה הזדמנות לערער בתשובה. Gave the wife of Lot an opportunity to do תשובה. ההבטה של אשת לוט לעבר אנשי סדום בעת ההפיכה הייתה הבטה של רשעות. When Lot's wife is looking back into towards the people of Sodom, it's a look of wickedness. כי אומרת לעצמה, מגיע להם עונש זה. They deserve this punishment. שהרי הם רשעים because they're wicked. אולם אני ובעלי צדיקים, but we are righteous. ההבטה הזאת הוסיפה רשות על רשותה ואכזריות על אכזריותה, and that adds wickedness to her and cruelty to her. ובעקבות כך החליט אלוקים שאין טעם להשאירה בחיים, and therefore God decided there's no reason to leave her alone. It's not because she looked back, but rather because what that act represented according to this interpretation. Meaning, God gave her an opportunity to do tshuva. If she's going to do tshuva, she's going to be saved. But if she's not going to do tshuva, and she's going to stay the same, then there's no point of leaving her alone and leaving her alive. You know, it's a moment of truth. In times like that, people need to make a decision. And God gave her that opportunity and she blew it. Now we also understand why she became specifically a pillar of salt. Salt is something that does not change. And it lasts for a long time without any change. And Lot's wife proved that she's just like that salt. Her wickedness, her cruelty stayed the same, stagnant, no improvement. And indeed, if that's the case, there's no reason for her to stay alive. The Tirgum Yonatan going to give us like a little bit of an angle about her, because was she bad? The wife of Lot, was she a righteous person? We don't know anything about her. But if you look at the underlined, it says, Dehi havat mibnathon disdomai. She was a local girl from Sodom. And I think that the Tirgum Yonatan is making that statement to show that indeed she was wicked. She was wicked just like the people of Sodom. And she was kind of representative of that city, of the mindset of that city. And in a similar way, Rashi is going to interpret the following. אפילו לוט הנמלט מהם באה רעה לאוהלו זה אשתו. שהייתה נציב מלח. כן מצאתי במדרש רבי תנחומה. Rashi quotes the Midrash saying that she was a bad person. And if you marry a bad person, what does it say about you? Rashi adds in a different place, דורשה לגנאי, על שהיו שטופי זימה בחר לו לוט בשכונתם. Lot made a conscious decision to go and live in Sodom. It's a very important point. I want you to make a mental note of that. If you remember, the shepherds of Lot and the shepherds of Abraham, a couple of chapters earlier, are fighting. And Abraham says to Lot, you know what? Hiparedna me'alai. Let's separate. You're going to go right, I'm going to go left. You're going to go left, I'm going to go right. And what happens? Lot looks and he sees Sodom. Kikar hayarden vehine kula kegan Hashem. What is it he sees? He sees the prosperity the physical materialism of Sdom. And he decides to go and live in Sdom, even though he's going to have very, very bad people as neighbors. We have a saying in Hebrew, Oy la'rasha ve'oy le'shcheno. Okay? If you're going to live if you're going to live in a certain community, you're going to become eventually part of that community. No one is an island. So that gives us a little bit of an understanding of Chazal about Lot. So he sees the potential, he doesn't care. And you understand, this is Abraham's nephew. This is the guy that grew up with Abraham. He should have known better, he knows better. Nonetheless, he chooses materialism. He chooses the green land of Sodom over values, even though he knows these are going to be bad people he's going to interact with. And then eventually, he marries a local girl. She is a bad person. Guess what? They have children. Those children are also, at least two of them, becomes also bad people because they married locals as well. So the Torah doesn't tell us exactly what happened in that story, meaning how did the people of Sodom find out that Lot is hosting the Malachim? We're going to get to that in a moment. But as we can see, there are already two approaches to interpret the behavior of the wife of Lot. On one hand, you can say she was looking for the materialism, just like Sodom, just like Lot, bad person, whatever. She was not listening to God. She was staying in the past. The other option is to say, perhaps she was sensitive. That's totally human and it's understandable. She was looking to see whether her daughters are going to join her. That's a natural reaction of a mother. Okay. Here's a midrash says the following. I'm in the fourth in this slide. Once the angels enter Sodom, התחילה אשתו מריבה בו. So you remember what happened is Lot take those angels home. And once he did that, his wife started fighting with him. אמרה לו, אי לך לוט, woe to you Lot, she told him, עכשיו ישמעו אנשי סדום בדבר וידונונו להריגה. Now the people of Sodom are going to hear about that. That's against the rules. And they're going to kill us. מה עשה לוט? What did he do? עמד וחילק את הבית לשני חלקים. So he divided the house into two sections. One section for himself and one section for his family. והכניס אורחים לחלק שלו. And he brought the guests into his own section. Why? Perhaps he was thinking, if it's a different unit, it's a different house, then his wife and his family are not going to be liable, responsible for what's happening in the other part of the house. It's a different unit, and therefore I have no responsibility of what's going on over there, and I should not be punished. אמרה אשת לוט, אילו רואים אותם רוחצים פניהם ידיהם ורגליהם, נמצאו הורגים אותו ואת אשתו ואת בניו. And she says, if the people saw what's going on, they would kill us. And we can understand that probably Lot was not an easy person to deal with. Perhaps he was trying to protect his family here, but also perhaps there's a different way to look at that. Midat Sdom shali shali v'shalach shalach. As I mentioned before, the characteristic, the rule of Sdom was what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. And therefore, Lot says, you know what, even to his own family, he says, like, you know what, you stay there, I stay here. and that's it. Don't come to me. Interesting statement in the Gemara in Masechet Eruvin. Amar Rabbi Chanina, הגיע לשכרותו של לוט פטור מכולם. Somebody who is as drunk as Lot, פטור מכולם, meaning he is exempt from the mitzvot. Of course, that is a reference to the story that's going to come up later in the Chumash, where Lot is going to be so drunk that he's going to sleep with his daughters. But somebody doesn't become so drunk without any pre-existing condition. So we can imagine, or we can perhaps suggest that maybe he was drunk, maybe he was had some issues even before the destruction of Sodom came, and we can imagine that because of that, perhaps it was not that easy for Irit or Edith, whatever her name was, to live with him. Two other midrashim trying to expand on the circumstances of that evening. רבי יצחק אמר, שחטא במלח באותו הלילה שבאו מלאכים ללוט. Rabbi Yitzchak trying to explain to us why specifically she was punished as being a pillar of salt. And the reason? Because her sin that night had to do with salt. מה היא עושה? What did she do? הולכת לשכנותיה ואומרת להם, she went to the neighbors and said, give me salt. שיש לנו אורחים, because we have guests. והיא מכוונת שיכירו בין אנשי העיר, and therefore by doing that, she made sure everybody understands, everybody knows that they have guests. על כן ותהי נציב מלח. And since she used salt as an excuse to spread the word that indeed they have guests against the law, therefore she became a pillar of salt. A different Midrash Agada says the following, הלכה היא אל שכניה לשאול מלח. Similar way, she went to the neighbors to borrow salt. ואמרה להם, אין אנו צריכים מלח. We don't really need salt. We have enough for ourselves, because I can't borrow from you anything, because what's mine is mine, yours is yours. So how come I'm asking you for salt? אלא שבאו אלינו אורחים. We have guests. That changes the equation. Now I don't have enough and I need to borrow from you. ולכך ידעו אנשי סדום שבאו אנשים לביתם. Therefore the people of Sodom knew that Lot and his wife were hosting guests. And in any event, as we learned already, she looked back and she became, whether because she was concerned about her daughters or because she was trying to save some of the wealth or whatever that is, or just because she was not moving, but either way, she becomes a pillar of salt. I want to talk about that rock for a second because it's a fascinating thing. So the Gemara in Masechet Brachot, and where this legend at this particular rock, and you can see it in the lower picture here, this rock is the one that we're talking about, kind of unusual rock that you can see when you drive on your right side. The Dead Sea is on your left side, and this is going to be on your right side when you go all like on Route 90. So that legend that this particular rock is the wife of Lot is interesting, and I was trying to figure out what is the source for that, where it's coming from, except for the unusual characteristic, physical characteristic of that rock, and the fact that it is indeed has a very high percentage of salt in it. So the Gemara in Masechet Brachot says the following: הרואה מעבורות הים, One who sees the crossing points in the sea, i.e., the place in the Red Sea, a specific location in the Red Sea where the Jews crossed the Red Sea, ומעברות הירדן, right? And also the place in the Jordan River where the Jews crossed, entering the land of Israel together with Yehoshua. And there's like a whole list of places like that. ואשתו של לוט, and one of those places is Lot's wife. על כולן צריך שייתן הודעה ושבח לפני המקום. One should recite a bracha and praise God. And the Gemara asks, Bishlo מה כולו ניבי מיסה, נבי מיסה. We understand all those places. We need to recite a bracha because what? Because great miracles occurred to our ancestors over there. Crossing the Jordan River, crossing the Red Sea, they were saved, etc. However, in the case of Lot's wife, this is a time, it was no great miracle. Not only that, it was anuta. It was a bad event. The Amar, Baruch Dayan HaEmet. She died. You say Baruch Dayan HaEmet. Ve'ahuda'ah b'shevach katani. However, the statement in the Gemara says Hoda'ah b'shevach, praise and thanksgiving. Tani, what's the answer? Alot ve'al ishto mevarchim shtayim. On that particular incident, on Lot and his wife, you say two brachot. Al ishto omer Baruch Dayan HaEmet. On Lot's wife, you say Baruch Dayan HaEmet. Ve'alot omer Baruch zochecher hatzadikim. However, with regards to Lot himself, you should say Baruch zocher hatzadikim, blessed who remembers the righteous people. And Rashi adds, Shezachar et Avraham, because of the merits of Abraham. Where this is coming from, like all this discussion, why it is coming? Now the Gemara says, Ishto shel Lot eina metamet, shemet metameh ve'en etziv melech metameh. We know that a corpse causes impurity. However, a rock does not cause impurity. So the question is, what is the halachic status of that rock? Is it considered to be a corpse, and therefore somebody who's going to touch that rock is going to be impure? Or it's a rock, and by touching the rock, you do not lose your status as pure. So perhaps this is like, there was the source for that legend that this particular rock is Lot's wife. And here's something I found in the Israeli paper from November 16th, 2017. Exactly 3 years ago. That Arab Chaim Kanievsky, this guy, who is the leading posek today in the world, after listening to testimony of all sorts of research people and looked at photographs, etc., he made a ruling that that rock is not Lot's wife. He asked that scientist, did you see bulls grassing in that area every day? And the answer was, once he learned that there are no bulls there, it's not a grassing area, it's not a grassy area, and there's no animals grassing in that area, therefore, the rabbi said it's not the Lot's wife, and he explains that according to the Chachamim, there were different circumstances about bulls and other animals probably that grassed during the day in that area, and also that particular pillar of salt. And at night, even though they ate from it, it would grow back. And if that's not the case, that's not what's happening there, and therefore, Rav Kanievsky Paskin gave the ruling that this is not the wife of Lot, but rather just a simple rock. Either way, it's a nice legend, and I recommend that you go and see that rock. Probably it's not the wife of Lot, but even if it is, or it's not, really it doesn't make much of a difference to us. What I want to do is I want to expand and move on to what I think is a very important aspect of that shiur. And this is what we're going to try to learn from it. Because if the Torah talks about the Sodom and the destruction of Sodom, it means that the Torah is trying to send us a very strong message. It's not just like there was place and there was like, and they were bad and God destroyed them. There's got to be something much deeper here. And let's see if we can find that. So when the angels come to Sodom and they go to Lot, the pasuk says the following: and he begged them, and he urged them to come, and they came to his house, to Lot's house. And he prepared a meal for them. Umatzot afa vayochelu. And what did he make for them? What did he bake for them? Matzah. By the way, this is the first time in the Bible that we find the word matzah. And every time we find a word in the Bible for the first time, it is very, very significant. And there's a reason why it's there. And we're going to try to understand what is the meaning of that matzah happening there. So the Radak says the following: since it was night and he didn't have time to start preparing all sorts of food, but rather he had to work quickly, and therefore he made matzah because he didn't want them to wait for a long time until the dough is going to rise. And whatever he was able to prepare quickly, that's what he did. And this is the right way to host your guests. You're gonna prepare something quickly. Because why? Because guests, when they come from a long way, they are tired, they're hungry, and they need to eat and drink and rest. And therefore, this story was written to teach us this lesson, that when you have guests, don't start bugging them with all sorts of questions. How was your trip and all that kind of stuff, but rather do something very quickly, let them eat, rest a little bit, because they are tired and hungry. However, Rashi has a different approach. Rashi on that pasuk says, what? Pesach haya. It was Pesach. And therefore, because it was Pesach, he baked for the matzah. What? Pesach? What are you talking about, Pesach? Pesach, as far as I remember, was created about 400 plus years later. Pesach and the baking of matzah, we read about it in the book of Exodus, when the Jews leave Egypt. Who was the one that went to Egypt? Jacob and his sons. But here we're talking about Jacob was not even born yet. We're talking about 400 years. So what are you talking about? It was Pesach. Pesach was not created yet. So what I'd like to suggest is the following. If you remember, before the three angels come to Abraham to tell him that him and Sarah are going to have a son, there's another story that says, "Vayi Hashemesh lavo," I'm right here in the red. "Vayi Hashemesh lavo v'tardema nafla al Avraham." Abraham fell asleep. "V'hinei ma chashacha gdola nofelet alav." And he has a vision. He has a dream, and in that dream, Hashem appears to Abraham and says to him the following: "Vayomer la'Abraham yadoa teda ki ger yezarecha be'eretz lo lahem." You should know that your descendants are going to be foreigners in a foreign country. ועבדום ועינו אותם 400 שנה, and they're going to be slaves for 400 years. וגם את הגוי אשר יעבודו דן אנוכי. However, at the end of the day, I'm going to avenge. ואחרי כן יצאו ברכוש גדול, and they're going to leave with great material. So Abraham already knows that his future descendants are going to be slaves. But he also learns that after slavery, the time of slavery, they're going to leave as a nation. And Rashi on that says the following. Quotes the Midrash, says the following. בט"ו בניסן באו מלאכי השרת אצל אברהם לבשרו, בט"ו בניסן נולד יצחק, ובט"ו בניסן נגזרה גזירת בין הבתרים. 3 events taking place on the 15th of Nisan, i.e. in 3 different years. Let's call it year 1, year 2, and year 3, even though we don't know if it was only 1 year between the first event and the second event. We do know it was exactly 1 year between the second and the third event, but we don't know how many years it was between event 1 and event 2. It seems from the Pshat that it was perhaps 1, 2, or 3 years, something in that neighborhood. First event is that dream that Abraham has where he learns about the future of his descendants as slaves. That took place, according to Midrash, on the 15th of Nisan. What is the 15th of Nisan? It's the first day of Pesach. So Abraham has this dream on the 15th of Nisan. Event 2 is the 15th of Nisan also, the first day of Passover, where the 3 angels come to Abraham and tell him that he's going to have a son. Him and Sarah are going to have a son. And then exactly 1 year later on the 15th of Nisan, Yitzchak was born. So what I'd like to suggest is that Abraham, following that dream, that very famous event called Brit Ben HaBetarim, he decides to start a family tradition, a holiday, celebrating the future redemption of his descendants. And since for him it was the 15th of Nisan, he continued to celebrate that tradition on the 15th of Nisan. That becomes a family tradition. And what happens also? Who is the one who grows up in the house of Abraham? That's his nephew Lot. Well, guess what? Lot learns that tradition of celebrating a holiday on the 15th of Nisan. And part of that holiday is eating matzah, because this is the bread what the descendants of Abraham are going to eat later on, 400 years later, when they are redeemed from Egypt, from slavery. So this is a tradition. This is a family tradition. On the 15th of Nisan, we eat matzah. And what happens? Listen to this, the last source here, fascinating, by the Rabbeinu Bechaye. Say the following. If you remember, when the angels come to Abraham, that's event 2, they come to tell him about the birth of Yitzchak. It says that what? He took dairy stuff, milk, butter. Later on, he serves them steak. There's no mentioning of bread. And Rabbeinu Bechaye tried to explain why was it that he served them milk and then meat. He says, you know why? Because he couldn't serve them chametz. ואברהם חשש לאסור חמץ. And Abraham could not serve them chametz, שהרי זמן הפסח היה, because it was Pesach. וזהו שהזכיר כאן עוגות, לושי ועשי עוגות. That he couldn't serve them chametz, because it was Pesach. And not only that, if you remember, the pasuk says that Abraham goes to Sarai and says to her, Lushi va'asi ugot, make cakes. Well, if she's going to do dough already, if she's going to do something with dough, why not bread? Why cakes? He said, why? I guess it was a kosher lePesach cakes, because it was Pesach and he couldn't serve them bread. Now he takes it another step. ובעניין לוט הזכיר מצות. And when it comes to Lot, a couple of chapters later, Lot served them matzot. Specifically, the Torah says matzot. כדי להשלים בין שניהם עוגות matzot. So if we take the ugot, we take the cakes, the word cakes, from the story in event 2 that is taking place at Abraham's tent, he served them cakes. Then the angels go to Lot. He serves them matzot. So now we have cakes and matzah. He says, like, all the Torah is connected, hints here and there. Whatever is hidden here, it's revealed here. And many other places in the Torah have the same idea, because what? If you remember the pasuk itself, when Bnei Israel left Egypt, is ויופו את הבצק אשר הוציאו ממצרים עוגות מצות כי לא חמץ. בני ישראל baked matzah, cake matzah, כי לא חמץ, not חמץ. Why? Because they had to flee Mitzrayim and they couldn't wait, etc. But the term עוגות מצות, Rabbeinu Bechaye breaks it down and he says, עוגות, cakes, we meet already 400 years before by Abraham. Matzot, we meet by Lot, and together it's the culmination of that is happening during the time of the Exodus, Ugot Matzot. And it's fascinating that this connection between Mitzrayim, leaving Mitzrayim, and Sodom is going to be more and more apparent, is going to be clearer and clearer as we continue. If you remember during the Leila Seder in the Haggadah, there's one song over there. Most people kind of mumble it and like don't pay attention to it. And it's called Va'amartem Zevach Pesach. And I just want to show you a couple of lines from there. The boldness of your strong deeds did you wonderfully show at Pesach. You revealed to the Ezrachi, that's to Avraham, midnight of the night of Pesach. You told him the future that was the first night of Pesach, just like the same tradition that Rashi quotes. Upon his doors did you knock? That's event 2. That's the 3 angels coming to visit Abraham at the heat of the day on Pesach. That was Pesach. That's event 2. So event 1, event 2. He sustained shining one, meaning the angels, with cakes and matzah on Pesach. Right? And to the cattle, etc. And then the Sodomites, back to our story of Lot, caused him indignation and he set them on fire on Pesach. Right? So the destruction of Sodom took place on Pesach. Lot was rescued from them. And matzot did he bake at the end of Pesach. So now it all makes sense. Because what happened? we said that the angels came to visit Abraham, event 2, right? They came on the 15th of Nisan, the first day of Pesach. They came to visit Abraham and tell him he's going to have a son named Yitzchak. And from there, the angels go to Lot. They go to Sodom to turn over the city. Well, it takes a little bit time to walk from Abraham in Beersheba all the way to Sodom. And guess what? That event is taking place, according to here at least, at the end of Pesach. So it's a couple of days. As far as I remember, Pesach is a whole week. So it took them a couple of days, 3, 4, 5, 6 days, whatever, to come to Sodom. It was still Pesach. Abraham, since it's the first day of Pesach, served them dairy and meat and cakes, all kosher Pesach. And Lot served them matzah because they're both maintain the same tradition that it's Pesach, and therefore we do not eat chametz, or at least eat matzah and kosher Pesach things. What's fascinating is, if you look at the text and you compare the two stories, the story of the destruction of Sodom and the story of the Exodus, you find extreme similarities in the language of the two stories. For example, in the story of Sodom, it says Za'akat. God says Za'akat. The cry of Sodom Amorah is great. Erdana ve'erea ketza'akata. I'm going to go down, metaphorically, of course. God says, and I'm going to see haketza'akata, what's going on over there. Right? Versus the story of Exodus. Ra'o ra'iti, I've seen. Same root. Ra'o ra'iti. What's going on to my people in Egypt? Ve'etza'akatam, the cry. Haketza'akata, tza'akatam, it's the same root. Ki yadati et machovav va'ered la'atzilo, and get, I'm going to descend, la'redet, to go down, to save my people from Mitzrayim. And again, tza'aka, it's the same root. Ba'a elai v'gam ra'iti. It's the same language again and again. Or for example, another example is, ויאמר קומו צאו מן המקום הזה כי משחית השם את העיר. Leave. קומו צאו. Right? Get up and leave. Go out. This is what Lot is being told. And in the night of the Exodus, ויקרא למשה ולאהרון לילה, ויאמר קומו צאו מתוך עמי. Same term. Paro is saying to Moshe, קומו צאו. Get up and leave. Same language. Or for example, a very unusual word in the Tanakh, vayitmahama, to prolong. Vayitmahama appears both, in both story. The Jews could not leitmahameha, and Lot is mitmahameha, and the angels are rushing them to go out. Another example, D. If you remember, the people of Sodom gather around the house of Lot, and they banging on the doors and they demand to have the people, the angels. Petach habayit. Okay, the door, or petach is the opening of the house. It's a term that appears many times in that story. Okay, and they couldn't find the opening because they blind them. The angels blind them. What happens in the Exodus during Makat Bechorot? Ufasach Hashem al hapetach. The opening of the houses of the Jewish people were leaked over. Below it mashchit, right? And so on and so forth. There are a lot of examples. How come the same language? And I think that the fact that we have the same language makes even a stronger connection between the two stories. Or actually, to be more accurate, it's not only the two stories, but rather the two places, Sodom and Mitzrayim. There's going to be a very strong connection here, and we need to reveal it. So when Rashi says Pesach Haya, it was Pesach, he's trying to get our attention that the way the Torah present Sodom and the way the Torah present Egypt. There's going to be something about that. There's going to be a very strong connection. But if we look back, the connection between Sodom and Egypt does not start when Sodom is being turned over, but rather way before, when Lot, as I mentioned before, chooses to go and live in Sodom. So when Abraham and Lot depart from each other, the Torah says to us about Lot's choice. And Lot looked about him and saw Sodom and Amorah like the garden of the Lord, okay, very fruitful, like the land of Egypt. Sodom, the Torah says here, is like Egypt, both very prosperous materialistically. Okay, as we know, in Egypt, they have the Nile River. So there's a connection between the two places. But even though we see that connection between Sodom and Egypt, the Torah is going to show us that also there's a tremendous difference between the two places. Let's go back to a couple of stories. Remember the First World War, when Abraham, there's a war between the 4 kings and the 5 kings, and Abraham learns that Lot, his nephew, is being taken into captivity, and he decides to go into action, and he saves Lot, and he's victorious. Abraham is victorious, and he wins the battle. And what happened is that he meets the king of Sodom. So Abraham just liberated Sodom and its people, and the king of Sodom come to him and he says, "Vayomer melech Sodom el Abraham, ten li hanefesh v'harachush kach lach." He said, "Take whatever you want. You won the battle. You deserve to take whatever you want." Vayomer Abraham el melech Sodom, but however, Abraham says to the king of Sodom, "Harimoti yadi el Hashem el Elyon, koneh shamayim va'aretz, im mechut v'atzroch na'al." I'm not going to take anything. V'im ekach mikol asher lach. I can't take anything. I'm not going to take anything from you. Okay? So that's hint number 1. Abraham refuses to take anything from Sodom. Fast forward. Actually, go back to Bereshit 12. Remember that story where there's a famine. Abraham needs to go to Egypt. And Paro is taking Sarah because she's very beautiful. Batukach Aisha bet Paro. And she's taken to Paro. Ula etiv ba'avura. And Abraham gained a lot of wealth because of that. And he gained a lot of wealth and animals, etc., and slaves and all that kind of stuff. So Abraham here accepts the gifts from Egypt. And later on, in the times of the Exodus, and also the Jews, they borrow from the Egyptians silver and gold. And they, and they take the gifts, borrowing possessions, materialism from Egypt. So let's summarize it for a second. Abraham tells us, shows us, Sdom is a no. I don't want to do anything to do with you. I'm not going to take from you even a shoelace, he says. Misroch, nal, even a shoelace. I'm not taking anything from you. He refuses. However, when it comes to Egypt, both Abraham and later on his descendants, the Jewish people, are taking all the gifts from Egypt. So so that means that Sdom is a big no-no, and Egypt, not so much. And what's going on here? We have to understand. Let's first fast forward a little bit. Who are the people of Sdom? Sdom is being destroyed. Lot is the only survivor. And he ends up in the cave with his two daughters, and they both give birth to a son. One is called Moab, and one is called Ammon. Fast forward to Sefer Dvarim, and the end of his life, Moshe says a law to the Jewish people, and he says the following: Lo yavo Ammoni u'Moavi b'kal Hashem. Ammon and Moab cannot be part of the Jewish people, no matter what. Gam dor asiri, even 10 generations, cannot be ever part of the Jewish people. He gives one answer here. Al dvar asher lo kidmu etchem b'lechem u'b'mayim b'derech b'tzatchem mitzrayim. Why? Because they did not greet you, Ammon and Moab, when you wanted to come to Eretz Israel. They did not greet you with bread and water. That's reason number one. Okay, but you may ask, what's the big deal? Other nations did not greet us with water and food. Perhaps there are higher expectations, higher standards when we talk about family, right? At the end of the day, we're talking about family. Moab and Ammon are our cousins, right? Lot, the father/grandfather of Ammon and Moab, is Abraham's descendants. So perhaps if family treats you like that, it's worse than if somebody, a foreigner, treats you like that. And reason number two, and if you remember that story that Bilam ben Beor, the prophet, is being hired by Ammon and Moab to curse the Jewish people, and because of that, they can never be part of the Jewish people. However, when it comes to, look at the red here, Lo tetayev mitzri keger hayita be'artzo, when it comes to Egyptians, you cannot have the same feelings towards the Egyptians. They can, they can become part of the Jewish people. Well, that makes no sense, because I don't understand. Yes, Ammon and Moab didn't greet me with food and water. That's bad. And because of that, they cannot be part of the Jewish people. But the Egyptians enslaved us and killed us and whatever they enslaved us for over 200 years. Isn't that worse? How come Egypt is a yes and Sodom, i.e. Ammon and Moab, is a no? So we need to understand. The Torah says, why can't we hate the Egyptians? Ki ger hayita be'artzo, because we were foreigners in Eretz Mitzrayim. Okay, but they treat me like dirt. Not only that, they enslaved us. They were terrible to us. So what's going on here? So let's summarize for a second. Egypt and Sodom are very similar because they both have materialistic wealth. They're both considered the garden of Gan Hashem, garden of God. However, the Torah tells us there's a tremendous difference between the two. Egypt and Sodom differ in the way they treat others, foreigners, outsiders. Mitzrayim, since Sefer Bereshit, from the very beginning, accept the foreigners, the strangers. Abraham goes down to Egypt when there's famine in Eretz Israel. Same goes for Yaakov. He's going to go to Mitzrayim because there's famine. And we learned that Mitzrayim provides and supports everybody during the years of the famine. Not only the Egyptians, but also the people in Canaan. Mitzrayim shares with others its prosperity and shares its wealth with others. Yes, there's going to be a heavy price to that. They take all the land, they enslave others, whatever. There's a very heavy price. Nonetheless, they still share their wealth with others. They accept strangers. Yes, they're going to be slaves, but still at least they're going to be alive. What's going on with Sodom? With Sodom, it's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. I'm not going to give you anything, even if you're going to die of hunger. Nobody is going to benefit from the wealth of the city unless is one of them. No entrance to strangers. And therefore, we understand why Sodom is much worse than Egypt. Somebody who's hungry would prefer to become a slave rather than dying. So perhaps we can take it another step forward and say that the difference between Sodom and Mitzrayim is like the difference between human rights and civil rights. Human rights are those rights that every person entitled to, regardless to his status, his legal status, his legal status. However, civil rights are given based on your status, your legal status as a civilian in the country. So, for example, we understand that voting, the right to vote, is given to citizens only. However, the right to live in dignity or freedom is given, or needs to be given, must be given to every person, even if that person is not a citizen. Sodom violates human rights. Egypt violates civil rights. In Sodom, there's no recognition of the others, of somebody who is an outsider. Egypt, even though they're going to enslave somebody, at least acknowledge their existence. And because of that acknowledgement, Egypt will support them financially. Yes, as slaves, but still they're going to be alive. And that's the difference between Egypt and Sodom. Now, the status in Egypt is not ideal. And the Torah talks about this idea of ahavat hager, of the fact that we need to love the foreigners. So that means Egypt is a step in the right direction. It's better than Sodom, but it's not the ideal. Okay, it's like talking about this idea of slavery, right? Slavery is, when the Torah talks about slavery, the Torah's view is against slavery. You're going to ask me, but the Torah is full of laws of slaves, and the Torah talks about the possibility of having slaves. Yes, because the Torah was written in a certain point of history. So the Torah says, I need to be relevant to people now, i.e., thousands of years ago. It's not ideal, but slavery is part of reality. So talking about a situation where there's a world with no slaves is not going to fly at that point of history. So what I'm going to do, the Torah says, I'm going to make amendment to that concept. Slave is not somebody is not a property. A slave is not somebody you can do whatever you want with. According to the Torah, when you have a slave, you need to take care of that slave. All the slaves' needs, and the slaves should have the same quality of life as the owner. It's a revolutionary thought. But eventually, the Torah tried to tell us, we should aspire to a world where there's no slavery at all. Same goes here. Here's what Rav Kook actually summarized that. אותם שרצו להעמיד את השאיפה לביטול העבדות בהווה, מפני שתמכו את עצמם בכתבי הקודש, הם דומים להצטגננים הרואים ואינם יודעים מה הרואים. אמנם יש ערך לחוק העבדות החוקית שיהיה משמש לטוב בעולם, אבל צריך לזה עולם מסודר כראוי. ומכל מקום, הד כל של אותם היתרונות שהעבדות פועלת באופן בלתי מבואר למחזיקים עצמם, הוא הגורם את התביעה מצד המחזיקים. אבל מבלעדי הכנה כוללת גדולה ועצומה, אי אפשר שיהיה העולם נשפע כראוי מקדושת כתבי הקודש, כי אם השם לבדו בהיותו מוכשר, הכשר פנימי יותר קרוב. רב קוק says something extremely profound. He said that great moral changes, like abolishing slavery, by the way, in this great country happened only in the 1800s. Stuff like that requires, as he called it, hachana kolelet gedola, a great preparation, moral one, organized one, realizing where we are and what we need to be. In other words, the Torah gives us an arrow, puts us in the right direction. The Torah was written in a certain point of history, and the Torah tells us what's ultimately where we need to be. And then we need to understand where we are in that process. Yes, you can't abolish slavery 5,000 years ago when the Torah was given, because the world was not ready for that. But in the year 2020, absolutely. And therefore slavery is wrong. The same goes for many, many other ideas. We spoke about korbanot in the past as well. When the Torah talks about animal sacrifices, so you can say, this is so barbaric, animal sacrifices. What kind of religion is that? But at that time, it was relevant because what? The world, people used to give human sacrifices. Comes the Torah and says, Human sacrifices are no, under no circumstances. And it's a step in between. So unlike the rest of the world who practice human sacrifices, the Torah comes and says, absolutely no, no human sacrifices, but I'm going to allow animal sacrifices because you are not ready for a world that deals with God in the way we view God today, without this medium, without that need for sacrifices, live sacrifices, with the fact that we pray to God, that replacing the animal sacrifices. And Rav Kook actually talks about that Mirza Hashem, when the third temple is built, no animal sacrifices are going to be brought. So we understand the direction. This has to do with slavery, with sacrifices, with many, many other examples in the Torah. And when we talk about Egypt and Sodom, there's a tremendous lesson here that we understand what is the direction. Yes, on one hand, we're supposed to be, I mean, we recognize what is the worst. The lowest point is the denial of human rights, the basics of the basics, treating people like people. Every person is a human being. Every person was created in the image of God. And therefore, every person deserves those basic human rights to live in dignity. Above that, and that was denied in Sodom, and therefore Sodom had to be destroyed. Above that is Egypt. In Egypt, the civil rights were denied. But at least people were recognized as human beings. Yes, they were treated wrongly, but still they were human beings. This is why we allow, or we have a better understanding, and we allow interaction with the Egyptians. They can become part of our nation. We're allowed to take the gifts, etc. But what is the direction? What is it that we're supposed to go? I think the message is clear. The Torah is trying to put us in the right path, where people live in dignity with all the rights, and they also can achieve a good life. That's the inspiration. That's what the Torah is trying to teach us. And this is what we're supposed to understand from that. I'm going to stop the sharing so you can see me for a second, and I will end this class now, and looking forward to see you in the next one. Bye-bye.